Witch hunting in the Middle Ages is one of the darkest and most terrifying episodes in European history. It was a time where fear and superstition were connected, creating an environment where ignorance and paranoia fed each other, and where the lives of many innocent people were destroyed by unfounded accusations. In this Halloween special, I will show you some real cases to illustrate the horror and despair of those times. In a small village in the Alsace region of what is now France, people lived in constant fear. The winter had been especially harsh that year. The crops had failed to bear fruit, and the livestock were falling ill. The villagers began to murmur about the evil lurking in the darkness. It didn't take long for them to point the finger at an old woman who lived on the outskirts of the village, in a lonely hut surrounded by knotty trees. The woman, named Katharina, was known for her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies. She had helped many people in the village, but in times of crisis her wisdom became suspect. It was said that her garden never died, even in the cruelest winters, and that the birds sang strange songs as they flew over her house. Some claimed to have seen her walking through the forest on full moon nights, whispering words they did not understand. It was then that a little girl fell seriously ill for no particular reason. Desperate parents turned to Katharina, but when her remedies failed, fear turned to hatred. The villagers began to whisper that the old woman had cursed the child, and soon a small crowd gathered in front of her hut, demanding justice. The tribunal that was set up to try Katharina was no more than a formality. The judge, a stern and superstitious man, was convinced that witches were real and that the influence of the devil was present everywhere. Katharina was dragged from her hut to the center of town, where she was accused of witchcraft. Testimonies against her were abundant and often contradictory. Some said they had seen her talking to animals, others claimed she had the power to control the weather, and a few claimed she had made a pact with the devil himself. None of these accusations had any basis in fact, but in a time when superstition reigned, it was enough for someone to say they had seen something strange for it to become real. Katharina, despite her advanced age, stood firm, denying all accusations. However, there was no way to convince the judges of her innocence. The most dreaded test of all was the water test, where she was tied up and thrown into a river. According to the belief, if she floated, it was because the pure water rejected her impure soul, confirming her guilt. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent, but unfortunately, innocence would no longer be of any use to her. Katharina floated. Katharina's story was not an isolated case. Throughout Europe, many other people were accused and executed for witchcraft. One of the most notorious episodes occurred in the German city of Würzburg during the 1620s. The city had been devastated by plague and war, and in the midst of such suffering, rumors of witchcraft began to spread. In Würzburg, Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg initiated one of the most brutal witch hunts in history. Convinced that witches were responsible for the evils plaguing his diocese, he organized trials and torture on an unprecedented scale. Horrific methods were used to obtain confessions, from the so-called pulley, a torture device that dislocated limbs, to the bed of nails, a bed covered with sharp spikes where victims were forced to lie. Among the condemned at Würzburg were not only lonely old women and healers, but also children, priests, and even nobles. No one was safe from suspicion. A boy as young as 10 years old was one of the many who confessed under torture to having participated in covens and flown through the air in the company of demons. Evidently, these confessions were the fruit of pain and desperation. But in those times, they were taken as irrefutable proof. It was not only in Northern Europe that these persecutions took place. In Spain, one of the best-known cases of witch hunting occurred in the small town of Zugarramurdi in Navarra. The caves of Zugarramurdi were considered a sacred place, where the locals celebrated rituals and festivals, some of which dated back to pre-Christian times. However, these ancient rites were viewed with increasing suspicion by the Spanish Inquisition. In 1609, a group of women from Zugarramurdi were accused of practicing witchcraft. It was said that they gathered in caves to celebrate covens, where they worshipped the devil and performed all kinds of dark acts. The accusations began when a woman, Maria de Schimildegi, confessed being a witch and denounced several neighbors. The Inquisition acted quickly, arresting more than 300 people. The process culminated in 1610 with the Auto de Fe de Logroño, where 31 people were convicted of witchcraft. Although most received lesser sentences, 5 women were burned at the stake. This case became one of the most important in the history of witchcraft in Spain. And although the Inquisition finally recognized that many of the confessions had been obtained under torture and that the accusations were false, the damage was already done. Witch hunts spread like wildfire throughout Europe, leaving thousands of victims in their wake. In Salem, Massachusetts, in the late 17th century, one of the most famous witch hunting episodes outside the European continent took place. Although Salem postdates the medieval period, its history is a reflection of the same fear and paranoia that fueled the hunts in Europe. It all began when a group of girls in Salem began behaving strangely, suffering convulsions and screaming that they were being attacked by invisible specters. Soon, the inhabitants of the small Puritan community began to point fingers at those they considered responsible for these attacks. As in Europe, accusations spread quickly, and soon dozens of people were arrested on suspicion of witchcraft. The Salem court, under pressure from a terrified community, conducted a series of trials that culminated in the execution of 20 people, most of them women. The trial methods were as unfair as those used in Europe. Testimony from wraiths and water tests were accepted as evidence. The madness ended when the authorities realized that there was no end to the accusations, and that even the most respected members of the community could be singled out and executed. As time passed, witch hunting began to diminish. The Enlightenment brought with it a change in the European mentality, where reason and skepticism began to replace superstition and fear. Authorities began to question the validity of the trials and evidence used to convict alleged witches. In many places, it was recognized that the victims of the witch hunts had been unjustly persecuted. However, the legacy of the witch hunts endured, and the stories of the women and men who were unjustly persecuted and executed became part of the collective memory. The caves of Zugarramurdi, the ruins of villages in Alsace, and the accounts of the tortures in Würzburg remain mute witnesses to a time when fear ruled over reason. Today, witch hunting is seen as an example of the dangers of superstition and fanaticism. In many of the cities and towns where these tragedies occurred, monuments have been erected in memory of the victims. In Salem, for example, There is a memorial dedicated to those who were executed during the trials, as a reminder of the wrongs of the past. The study of the witch hunts teaches us the importance of justice, reason, and compassion. It reminds us to be wary of rumors and unfounded accusations, and that fear should not be the basis on which we build our societies. It is a warning that ignorance and hatred can lead to destruction, and that we must always strive for truth and fairness. This video is a journey through one of the darkest chapters in human history. Although full of horror and tragedy, it is also a story of warning and hope. The witch hunt shows us the dangers of unchecked superstition, but it also gives us an opportunity to reflect on how we have progressed as a society and how we must continue to strive for a more just and humane world.